Implementation is not easy. Implementing things and actually having an impact is even harder. Now, how we think about things is important because that affects how we approach them. So I think if we want to have impact, we need to approach implementation in a certain way. And I'm going to be sharing that with you today in hope that it will help you on your implementation journey. And this is going to be the first video in a series on implementing for impact. My name is Christian Hudson. I'm an implementation specialist, and I work within the Yorkshire Humber Applied Research Collaboration. I'm also based within the Improvement Academy, which is located at the Bradford Institute for Health Research in Yorkshire, UK. So how might we think about implementation in a way that's going to be useful and help us get actual impact when we're trying to implement something? Well, one way is to think of it as happening in stages. This is the Stages of Implementation framework. You can check this out at the National Implementation Research Network's website here. And it's kind of saying, well, actually, implementation is a process, and we go through these stages and eventually we'll reach full implementation. And there are different things that you have to do at each stage. It isn't necessarily linear. You can move back and forth. But if you go through these steps and you do these things at each stage, eventually you'll reach full implementation. This is the Quality Improvement Framework. Very similar. It's saying, well, implementation occurs in phases. And if you go through these phases and you do these things at each phase, eventually you'll learn from experience and reach implementation. In this case, it's a continuous process. This is also another framework. This is talking about translating research into practice. So very often we might have something that we research, some scientific knowledge that we develop, and it needs to eventually get into practice. And again, it's similar. It's saying it's a step-by-step process. If you follow these steps, you start with your basic research, you go into prototype discovery, and then eventually get to healthcare delivery. There are all these organizations involved in this process, and it's quite complicated. So this is showing us that implementing or translating research into practice is a causal linear process. It's mechanistic. You go through these steps and you eventually get to where you want to get to. And it's the same with the other frameworks there, cause and effect. That you do these things at each stage and eventually you'll implement. These frameworks might also, when you look at implementation this way, when you approach it in this way, you might think that actually that means if somebody's successfully implemented something in one setting, whether it's an evidence-based practice, an innovation, some new idea, well, if we follow the same steps in new sites and new settings, we'll also achieve implementation. And so that's what another way of thinking about implementation. But anyone who's been involved in an actual implementation process, maybe try to implement something in a school or in a hospital or out in the community, they'll know that the reality is actually quite different. And that's because we're working in highly complex open systems characterized by dynamically changing interrelationships and tensions. So every site, every project, every team exists in complex systems made up of stakeholders with varying levels of interest, capacity, and time, all interacting in different and unpredictable ways. So how these agents interact with each other and with their context is locally specific. So they may share some similarities with other teams and contexts, but generally exhibit remarkable differences. So if you've been implementing something in one, say, hospital ward or one school, and you've learned and you've been working hard and you've managed to implement it, you've got to know the people there, you've got to know the context. When you go to a new context, you're going to have to learn all that stuff again because it's going to be very complex. It's going to be different. People have different amounts of time, interest, capacity, etc. This has big implications when it comes to thinking about implementation, because the implementation of anything new is rarely simple or straightforward and has to find a place in an intricate pre-existing social environment. Implementing a new practice in the same manner across a health system becomes untenable. Do be sure to check out Penny Hall's work. I've been trying to get her on the podcast for a while. I really like her work. So this has huge implications. So when we think about implementation and how to approach it, we need to acknowledge the complexity of what we're actually trying to do. Now, this may explain why the failure rate's so high of implementation. As Laura Damstroder here is saying, many implementation efforts fail. Even with highly developed plans for execution, they fail because contextual factors can be powerful forces working against implementation in the real world. So there's many things that can stop implementation. And many of these things are unpredictable. So these mechanistic, simplified views of implementation in the world cannot wish away its complexity. That's just a reality that we have to deal with. So we've got these maps, we've got these process frameworks, these implementation frameworks, which are useful, but we still aren't dealing with contextual issues as they arise. And that may be why the failure rate becomes so high. So maps don't really tell us or teach us how to do that, how to deal with things as they arise. So the reality is that innovative journeys are much more convoluted, imprecise, uncertain, ambiguous, and deceptive than some implementation frameworks might suggest or be interpreted to suggest. So this David Whyte, the English poet, says, stop trying to change reality by attempting to eliminate complexity. And also, just a final point here, implementing into healthcare settings has become inconceivably complex. So it's got harder and harder as the decades have gone on. Now we're dealing with such complex systems. We really need to be careful in how we approach implementation. So this is a great way, I think, of thinking about it. So this is a flyer that was put together by the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre. You can check this out here and check out more of their work at this link. So what they're saying is complex is not the same as complicated. So consider these three different problems: baking a cake, sending a rocket to the moon, and raising a child. Now, baking a cake, well, as a problem, that's quite simple. Defining it's quite clear. We just want to bake a cake. The rules, well, if you apply the same rules each time, you're probably going to get the same cake, right? Now, what expertise is required? Well, there isn't really that much expertise required, because I think most of us can take a recipe book and follow it and make a cake. And the more we do that, the better we get at it. So the success really just lies on being able to follow that protocol. Now, building a rocket is similar, but it's a lot more complicated. So the problem isn't simple, it's complicated. And there is some uncertainty about what problems will arise during this process. And the rule is that really, if you continuously follow the rules, you can improve them until you find a process that's repeatable and eventually leads to the building of a rocket. So it does require high levels of expertise in specific areas. And the road to success is really to experiment until you develop a protocol to do this. And people have done this now, and we have protocols to develop rockets, and NASA and people will follow those and develop rockets. But what about raising a child? Well, that's a complex problem. So it's different. It's not a simple or a complicated problem. It's complex. This is because there's a lot more uncertainty. You don't know what the child's going to do from 1 minute to the next. It's unpredictable. There's also no direct transference from context to context. So one parent may say, well, I do this with my child and it works. Another parent, well, that doesn't work with my child. You don't know what's going to work until you're actually in the moment trying things out and problems are emerging. Now, the expertise is also, there isn't really an expert that can tell you how to raise a child. They can give you advice, but when it comes to raising your own child, and you'll know this if you're a parent, that just comes from, a deep knowledge that you develop over time of working with that child. So here it's deep knowledge of contextual dynamics, and you only get that from trying. So the success then relies on adaptation and continuous learning. So you think, oh, I know how to feed my child well, but then the next day, oh, the child's being really fussy. Oh, I need to adapt to that. So you're learning all the time how to deal with problems as they arise. So this is the difference. This is a great flyer because it really captures that. Implementation is a complex problem. That's the way to approach it. That's the way to think about it. And I think if we're not careful, we can look at some of these frameworks and these very useful maps and think, yes, we just follow these complicated steps to get there. But the reality is it's actually complex. So how should we approach implementation? Well, instead of thinking of it like not getting wet from the waves, we might want to actually think about it as learning to move with the waves to make something great happen. So we're trying not to get wet from the waves. Again, this is kind of, well, there's some uncertainty, but if we keep experimenting, eventually we'll probably develop a protocol to not get wet from the waves. But if we think about implementation as a complex problem, it's different. It's more like trying to sail. It's trying to learn to move with the wave. It's a bit like sailing. There's a lot of uncertainty. You can't rely on the experience on, say, one day of sailing on one particular lake or ocean and transfer it to another. It won't be exactly the same. You don't know what the weather's going to be like. You don't know what the boat might be like. There might be other people sailing. You just don't know what's going to happen. The only way you really get good at sailing is to keep doing it. It's like, instead of just reading about sailing, you keep going and doing it. And it's by that trying, over time, you learn to adapt to lots and lots of different issues as they arise, and you continuously learn. So you eventually become really good at sailing. And that's, I think, how we should approach implementation. So just some quick tips, really. If you're going to be using an implementation science framework like the ones I showed you, they are really useful. Maps are great because they tell us where we're going. But I would just say that make sure that whatever framework, tool, or technique you use, that it does acknowledge the complexity of the reality you're working with. And in particular, perhaps acknowledge that need for adaptation. And I'll talk more about adaptation in my next video. Also, have some processes in place that allow the people trying to implement to actually learn how to implement. So if you've got some people that you're trying to get them to, say, learn to sail a boat, but you're not actually giving them time to go sailing, they won't actually achieve the outcome that you're looking for. It's the same with implementation. We want to give them time to learn how to implement whatever this thing is you're trying to implement in whatever setting, with whatever people, to reach whatever goal. It'll be different every time, but you need to give them time to learn. Now, improvement practices are pretty useful for that. They stem from improvement science, and they allow for this continuous learning over time and allow people to learn how to adapt. And I'll talk more about those in another video. Also, co-production is a great way to capture that deep contextual knowledge. People that are in the setting that have really, say you're trying to implement in the community, you go and talk to the people in the community and you build a solution together to whatever problem you're trying to address. And so that's why it's a good approach. You also want a shared vision so everyone knows where you're going, and trust is vital, because if there's trust between the people involved in the implementation, it will actually decrease how complex things are. Finally, if you want to research implementation, use approaches that can deal with complexity, because some research approaches won't actually deal with it that well. They'll again be seeing it as a mechanistic approach, a mechanistic process. So realist evaluation is quite good. Long-term case studies, participatory research. These are approaches that might be better at dealing with complexity. Also, systems mapping, social network analysis, stakeholder analysis are great ways to understand your context and its complexity. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be posting some more in a kind of series over time. If you want to get in touch, if you want help with, say, planning for implementation, actually carrying implementation out, evaluating implementation, researching implementation, do get in touch so we can make sure that the things you're implementing actually have an impact. Thanks for watching.